I can try.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, John Almendinger.
Well, good. Thanks for a little bit of time, Greg. Time for stories now, I guess. Put my TV face on. And last year, I obviously put this together last year when I thought I had 40 minutes to give a talk, and I was too lazy to fix it. So I thought I'd just talk fast today. Eli solved the problem of questions and interruptions, so I'll cruise line along with that. But I want to start by saying I've been doing this a while. 20 years ago, we decided to cooperate with the U.S. Forest Service in putting together a map for Minnesota of all these stuff using the national hierarchical mapping that was adopted by the Forest Service. So we obviously worked cooperatively with the Chippewa National Forest and Superior National Forest here in Minnesota. And I would describe that exercise as herding cats. Dan Hansen was the guy who coordinated it statewide. And basically we invited anybody who had a map that thought had something to do with vegetation, got to come and have a place at the table. It was entirely arm waving and what I call armchair ecology. Nobody collected data, nobody analyzed anything. We just put a bunch of ecologists, soil scientists, people from the Geological Survey, University of Minnesota, and maybe the Nature Conservancy, anybody who had a map got to show up and tell me why they thought it explained all of the vegetation patterns in the state. And to be quite honest, Dan did a remarkable job, and the product that we put out 20 years ago has held up fairly well, but it was time for revision, which is where Greg comes in. He stopped at our offices a couple years ago, and we talked about the kinds of changes we'd like to make to that map. So, believe it or not, we learned something in those 20 years. We learned mostly from the field work up. So it's sort of the bottom up part, or contributes to the bottom up concept that Greg was talking about. And that is we had around 26,000 vegetation plots in the state after 20 years went by. And one of the coolest things we found out in using, I don't know if you're all familiar with cluster analysis, but the computer looks at a big pile of samples and puts them in two groups, basically. We found out if you start making maps of every cluster split, where's this group and where's this group, at some scale, I guarantee you, you will see geography, which we did. And surprisingly, even small vegetation plots showed this coarse scale pattern in the state of Minnesota. Ultimately, we called those things floristic regions because they seem to have similar sets of plants available to occupy everything from wet to dry habitats. But there were these distinct floristic areas of the state of Minnesota. And so the next question is, well, why do we have these things? Greg came with a million climate maps and all kinds of cool stuff, but they didn't line up with some of our old lines and not so much with modern data. So because I got to rush a little bit, I'm going to tell you the bottom line first. History matters. What we finally figured out by looking at these regions is that they all had similar sequences of vegetation change since deglaciation. So they held together that way because they have similar paleohistories throughout the Holocene. So for the past, let's just say 10,000 years, these floristic regions had similar changes in vegetation. Interesting. What does that mean? I think it means that past climate has been important too. Most of those changes in the Holocene had to do with climate change, experiencing some temperatures as warm as what we're forecasting now. So a lot of that vegetation went through those stages, and it means a couple of things. But one thing it tells me is that first of all, one thing we found out is that every place in Minnesota has had fire influence or fire dependent vegetation in the past. Some of those plants persist. They're still out there because it used to be a prairie, it's now a pine forest, but some of those plants are still out there. So the take home message for today is we may have more acres to manage using fire or techniques aimed at emulating fire than we think. We can bemoan the loss of prairies all day long, but there are things that we can do silviculturally where we have a lot of trees, where we manage commercial timber, that might do a lot of those species pretty good, even though you're not going to end up with a restored prairie. So that's the take-home message, and now I better get going. Make sure I know what button to push. Is it the right one? It is. Start where I know virtually nothing. In 32 years, I hardly ever went out here. I've had some very fun field trips with the Nature Conservancy out in this country, but as far as work goes, not so much, and the reason for it is there aren't no trees, and I work for the Division of Forestry. And if there is a tree, it's aspen. So, you know, big deal. We don't have to do it. That's important. So, this is the landscape that's up in, oh, the doggone, every time Microsoft changes character sets. Well, anyway, those little dirty places in northwestern Minnesota is where we have all of our vegetation sampled to this community. So we're talking about the Aspen Parklands, and in Minnesota anyway, it occurs entirely in the basin of Glacial Lake Agassiz. And it looks something like that picture there. It's a mosaic of stuff. And it's really cool. We keep trying to figure out why there's mixes of prairies, mixes of wetlands, and mixes of forest out in this country. It's a topsy-turvy landscape, believe it or not. It's all flat, clustering clay, hardly any fall to it at all. But where the Red River has incised into those clays, and where the tributaries to the Red River have incised, there's actually better drainage in the low spots in this landscape than there are in the high ones. The high features are beach ridges, which is, you're looking down a set of beach ridges right there in this photograph, or the beach ridges, alluvial fans, stuff like that, and it's sandy. So we have these long sandy things and this clay all around them. So water is essentially piped down these beach ridges and comes out at the bottom in the some of the higher spots in the landscape. So you never know what's going to be wet. You never know what's going to be dry. And you can never tell if you're walking uphill or downhill out here. So, but the result, or at least the apparent natural result, are these mosaic-y things like this is what you're seeing there. On the ground, they very commonly look like this. This is a beach ridge with aspen on it, and a nice wet meadow and shrub car in the seepage zone at the bottom of that beach ridge. In some places, wind has remodified these shoreline features, and you get dunes. Those are, in general, the very driest spots that we got, and they were almost entirely dry prairies. These are our illustrious forests in Winaska, otherwise known as two-stick Winaska, if you foresters know what that means. But anyway, not very productive. This is a really old one. Here that you're seeing, very poorly stocked, it always has been. And due to fire exclusion in the region, or chopping up into mostly ag land now, we're seeing a lot of bur oak and green ash in the understory. So that's the pictorial history. To sum up, almost exclusively it all occurs in the Aspen Parkland province, Minnesota, but goes way up into Manitoba, which is why it's in its own province that goes up there. Parklands at a transition between Great Plains and Canada's boreal forest. The soils are developed almost entirely on sandy shoreline features, beaches, shoreline, alluvial fans, Glacial Lake Agassiz. We see three community classes that are broken out largely on soil drainage. And quaking aspen is by far the dominant tree, sometimes mixed with bur oak or balsam fir. And as you go into Canada, you'll start seeing lots of more, or increasingly more, jack pine and white spruce in these. Finally, history. I told you it was important. So this is a timeline of the history of what we think we know about our northwestern fire-dependent communities. You're going to see in all of these a spruce woodland community in the late glacial times. That community was essentially a community of stagnant but still collapsing ice. There were spruce forests on top of glaciers after they developed enough deposits and regolith on top of the ice to support trees. So it was the community of this unstable landscape. But when it stabilized, these places were immediately prairies. The pollen site is where that little, I guess they gave me a pound sign up there, but there are almost no lakes in this place, so there are very few places to get any kind of stratigraphic history. That's in the Assiniboine Delta up in Manitoba. Other places at the Tiger Hills and places like that up in Manitoba just were not the same landscape as we had here in Minnesota. So they were initially prairies, and they were most similar, at least floristically, to our northern prairies. And sometime around 2,000 years ago or 1,500 years ago, they started to become more afforested with almost entirely aspen and bur oak. And so they've probably been what they are today for around 1,500 years, something like that. It's not an ancient ecosystem by any stretch of imagination. History is important for this reason. Upland northern prairies are an exceedingly rare community. Maybe a lot of you are involved in trying to restore these things. Our northwestern fire-dependent forests, though, are not common because the area is so agricultural in nature, but we have more of that than we have certainly of prairies. The number, that red circled 40 that you're seeing, that's the percent overlap in the more common species in those two floristic regions. So the point is, if you manage FDW forests, you might come up with some silvicultural tools, fire included, that can do the prairie flora, at least 40% of it, some good. So that's what I put this in here for. The fire regime. What do we think that was? The stand regenerating fire is in the middle column, and the far column on the right-hand side is our estimate of what we think was maintenance fire rotations. And critical things to know: rotation to stand replacing fire is about equal to the longevity of the initial cohort trees. We've estimated bur oak lived about 97 years out there, and Balmagilead at around 69. The rotation of maintenance fires is very much less, though, than the longevity of initial cohort trees. So why do you think you would expect succession in this place? Probably only very rarely happened when places just by chance escaped fire long enough to show any kind of natural successional change from one tree species to another. We've estimated the intensity to be moderate, severity fairly low because it burns so often, you just don't get huge buildups of fuel. The extent, generally extensive. This is a big flat landscape, and I'm sure there were just monster fires out there historically. So that's the regime. Let's think now just about a second about normal stand dynamics as I've reconstructed them. Oh geez, now I'm supposed to use this arrow thing, forget it. Sorry, the other room. The ordinate here is the largest tree at a survey court. So in a sense, it's sort of the stand diameter. It's the size of the larger trees in the stand. And I've gone ahead and estimated how old those trees of that diameter might be. The actual graphs show the percentage of those bearing trees that were in that diameter class. So small diameter classes had around 80% aspen and maybe 10% bur oak and a little bit of jack pine. And by the time you got to 17-inch stands, they're about half aspen and almost half bur oak. Understand how it works now? You're going to see a few more of these, and I'm not going to explain them next time. All right. So, oh yeah, also here are the distances that the trees are apart from each other. And those are the means are the white sections of the bars, and standard deviations are the black section. So if the black sticks out farther than the white, the coefficient of variation is greater than 1. In other words, when that happens, it's really probably a pretty patchy environment. And when the means start to, when the standard deviations start to get down around the actual average, the mean, they're probably more uniformly distributed trees. Okay, so here we go. Oops. Non-successional due to chronic burning on a rotation of about 15 years. Young forests were strongly dominated by quaking aspen that were sparsely stocked. The means are out almost around 100. I'm sorry, I'm going to use links. Foresters are so happy to use change and then they don't understand links. I don't get it. They want to know feet. But in any event, around 100 links, that is a very sparse young forest. The transitioning involved, if there is any movement in tree abundance, it had to do with the decline of initial cohort aspen, large gaps, and ultimate replacement by bur oak, which is got a little bit tolerant. And mature forests were still sparsely stocked, but way more evenly so. Can you see that the standard deviations are even less than the means? This always happens with bur oak. Don't ask me why. We got experts all over the place here. Somebody tell me why. But if you're looking at jack pine or you're looking at aspen, the standard deviations are way out beyond the means. They were very patchy, and when you look at bur oak, they're very close to each other. It has to be some kind of interaction between the trees. They're way too far apart for any crown explanations of what might evenly spaced trees. It's got to be underground someplace. I think some of these bur oak root systems are just ancient, and they get big, and then they to a point where they interact with each other. Don't know. That's my hypothesis. Let's move on to southern fire-dependent forests. They occur in that brown strip. You can barely see some of the samples that I've got there. But these all occur in places where topography is rough enough to knock down fires and to get a patchier kind of fire moving through these systems. So they occur where there's rugged topography. The pictures from the very southeastern part of the state, where the section of the Paleozoic plateau provides the rugged topography. This is along the St. Croix River, where the river and its tributaries have created some rough topography. If you're a forester and want to know how to establish a pure oak stand, try to make a savanna where there shouldn't be one. That's what this is. We gave up, and it's entirely stocked, nothing with oak. When they mature, this is a sand dune state forest in the state. When they mature, they look something like that. And I wanted you to see there in the lower left-hand corner of that picture are some white pine trees. So some of the first conifers. If there's going to be a conifer in our southern fire-dependent forest, it's going to be a white pine. There you go. So, and here it is just in the understory. So we're starting to see white pine do pretty well. It has done very well since settlement. So we're starting to see more and more white pine in our southern fire-dependent forests. So to summarize, holy smokes, occurs almost exclusively in the eastern Broadleaf Forest province, which continues, of course, across Wisconsin to Indiana and makes a big loop. I don't know if it still does. Does it still make a big loop and go to Missouri? Well, anyway, pay attention to the people from Missouri here at this conference, because they might have more to say about our oak management in these areas. There, woodlands are there, the transition zone between Great Plains and Mesic hardwood forests. Rugged topography determines where they're going to be. As long as the soils are pretty well drained, they can occur on pretty much any landform. They're more interested in the rugged topography. Ice contact, bedrock, dissection, anything, doesn't matter. And we've got several community classes along a gradient of poor to very rich stuff that's developed on wind-blown loess in the southeastern part of the state. And they all involve oaks of some kind, mostly northern pin oak, black oak, northern red oak, bur oak, and white oak, and a variety of hybrids that you might expect. Their history. Well, starting with that spruce woodland period, all of a sudden you see this. You see, oh, we've had a community that looks just like our northern fire-dependent forest. It was jack pine, it was red pine, and lots of bracken fern. There are fern spores all through these sediments. And I don't know what that is, but that was certainly at that point in time, the extent of jack pine in Minnesota is at its greatest. South of St. Cloud and out in prairie country. So it never ever recovered from that after it was converted to prairies during the warm and dry mid-Holocene. And starting around 4,000 years ago, which is almost universally a signal of cooler and moister climatic conditions. Doesn't matter what communities you're studying, these almost always see vegetational change 4,000 years ago, where it was converted to these forests that are very similar to the ones we have nowadays. So here's the overlap between the communities that these sites have historically been. And once again, these are not particularly common. FDS communities are fairly rare, once again, largely because they're in an area that's got agricultural development and the Twin Cities of all things. So there you go. And southern prairies are very, very rare. So if you get the opportunity, we've got a couple people from our Rochester office here. If you get the opportunity to do some burning or do some kind of silviculture in our FDS communities, chances are you can lifeboat maybe 27% of the plants you'd find in the southern prairie. Disturbance regime. Rotation of stand replacing fire. Once again, about equal to the longevity of initial cohort trees. Bur oak living the longest, so we've estimated 122 years, more so than aspen, estimated at 75. Rotation to maintenance fires, once again, is very much shorter than the longevity of the initial cohort trees. So once again, we don't expect much in succession. Fire intensity is moderate. Severity is probably low. First of all, I mean, basically fires are winnowing through these communities, leaving oak trees. That's pretty much what's going on. And could be extensive in FDS 37, but generally rather small fires and discontinuous and rugged topography for the others. Normal dynamics, it's non-successional due to chronic burning on a rotation of about 15 years. It's a mixture of aspen and bur oak, no matter how old or how large a diameter stand you're talking about. Young forests were dominated by quaking aspen, and bur oak were sparsely but uniformly stocked. Look at this curve. Can you see that the means and standard deviations are all almost the same? And the distance we're talking about now is 80 lengths instead of 100 between trees. Transitioning involved the decline of initial cohort aspen, releasing some bur oak. And here we do see some ingress, even historically, of red maple, basswood, and green ash, and also white pine. So these become, I want to say mesophytized, that's the wrong word. It's mesification anyway. Due to fire suppression or fire exclusion from these areas, they can become pretty full of red maple and basswood fairly quickly. Mature forests were still sparsely stocked, and oak woodland with some second cohort aspen and some of the more tolerant trees. Let's move to the central part of the state, that green area that's there. This picture is one of the few fire origin stands left from the Badura fire, 1958. You notice how sparsely stocked the stand is. That is perfectly natural in these woodlands. They aren't big producers. The ground layer, you might as well be walking in a prairie. That's all prairie willow. A little bit of recruitment underneath in terms of some red pines coming in the understory. Similar, I think it's the same community, but different state forests in Lion State Forest. They can be pretty grassy in the understory. It's almost entirely big blue stem. Sometimes we start to see the development of these mossy and blueberry little patches in these forests. For you wildlife nuts, like savannas, do you? The word savanna occurs 25 times in the entirety of all the line notes and everything that we've got. And it all, as I recall, it all has to do with crossing the Savannah River. So it was used as a proper noun. If we had savannas, the surveyors didn't use that word to describe them. That's all. We probably did have something like that. I think grazing animals, bison and elk, probably made some of these places look quite a bit like a savanna. And if you want to know what they did here, they did burn it a couple of times, but gave up and started mowing it, and found mowing worked a whole lot better than the burning part. So, but if you leave it alone and you have a native grassland ground layer, this happens. Jack pines keep filling these places in. And I'll never forget the irony. I don't work for Dynar anymore, so I can tell these stories. The wildlife managers are all complaining that they got to keep mowing their wildlife openings, you know, on a very regular basis. There are those crummy jack pine trees come in there. And I've gone to several sessions as part of the Division of Forestry, going down to the Lyon State Forest and asking ourselves, how come our plantations didn't work? So keep the native ground layers message. Occur almost exclusively in the Minnesota Drift and Lake Plains section, and that is pretty much limited to the state of Minnesota. These fire-dependent pine woodlands, and they had prairie remnants through them, occurred in the most fire-prone landscapes within the matrix of upland forest. These forests are strongly associated with outwash plains, but basically the big sediment trains coming from the glaciers. So they're very wide and very big outwash plains with now underfit rivers, including the Mississippi in there, and the Crow Wing River, for example. Soils are excessively well-drained sands, and there's very little horizon differentiation in them. And we have community classes that are recognized on the grading of poor to richer soils. And the richness has mostly to do with the amount of organic matter that's in them. And the amount of organic matter that's in them depends on how long ago it was a prairie. And it takes about 1,500 to 2,000 years for a 6% soil organic matter content sandy prairie soil to end up looking pretty much like any other pine forest soil with only 1.5% or so of total organic matter in it. And they're all pine dominated. In this state, it's jack pine, red pine, and white pine. The history is probably the most complicated. We're in that transition zone where these ecotones have been moving around in history. The overlap of FDC communities with these other things, 48%, and so southern fire-dependent forests. It shares a lot of the flora with some of those southern forests. And for prairies, I mean, mostly of our northern floristic type, 29% overlap. So if you can manage an FDC community using anything that emulates fire or using fire itself, you have an opportunity to lifeboat a few species. The fire regime, rotation of stand replacing fire is about equal to the longevity of the initial cohort trees, with white pine at 122, aspen at 68. Rotation of maintenance fire was less than the longevity of the initial cohort trees, but starting to go up compared to the other communities we looked at, around 30 years for maintenance events. The intensity is severe. We're finally in a coniferous forest. So lots of these fires were very severe. I've been out on several where the ground is just red after the fire goes through. Severity was moderate as far as the trees being able to resist it. And the extent was generally extensive across these big flat sand plains. Normal dynamics. Succession follows what I call the longevity model of woodland maturation. For example, here, quaking aspen and jack pine could have both been in the initial cohort, but by the time the diameter goes up to around 10 inches, you see a lot more jack pine. I think that's simply because the aspen dies and the jack pine didn't. So it has to do with how long trees live. Young forests were dominated by quaking aspen and jack pine, but they were very sparsely stocked. We're down to, no, this is sparse for true forest, but we're down to around 60 lengths or 70 lengths between trees at this stage. Can you see how variable they are though? This was really patchy. There were prairie-ish openings. There were places where dog hair thick, probably jack pine, and anything in between. So it's very patchy. Might say something about our expectations and plantation success. Transitioning involved the decline of initial cohort aspen, followed by that of jack pine, and ultimately release of red pine and a certain amount of ingress of the more tolerant white pine as they matured. So, yeah. Often we see multiple cohort stands here too. We had surface fires and some trees that were fairly resistant, so it's not uncommon to see both fire scars and trees dating to the years of those fire scars on those trees. We're going to head up north now, but I did divide this into two things because we have our FDN communities that occur on sand. They're clearly similar to some of the central ones on sand. And then we have our fire dependent communities on the Canadian Shield itself. This is a picture here of a pretty typical one on sand. This is, I think, somewhere on the Chippewa National Forest around Cutfoot. This is not my picture, but they often will see some fire scars and some charcoal going up the sides of trees. This is an insanely successful seed tree experiment in the Chippewa National Forest. There were 14,000 trees per acre after we did this. There's still 10,000. So last time I counted trees there, I did not want to be there. They're all about 10 feet tall now. It's a jungle. But nonetheless, I mean, we got way too many trees in there. So, but worked well. And for you who think red pine trees can't grow underneath other red pine trees, that hasn't always been the case. I'll put it that way. I know we have diplodia concerns, but this was pretty typical. This is the Cutfoot. These are pictures, historic pictures from the Cutfoot Experimental Forest. So, to summarize, occurs almost exclusively in our new southern LMF province, which extends eastward across Wisconsin and Michigan. They're in sandy outwash and shoreline deposits, glacial lakes. We only recognize two classes here. That's the gradient of moisture and richness. And FDD communities are all pine dominated, and associated trees in this case now have an affinity with the Great Lakes flora, more so than anything, which will be different from the ones on the Canadian Shield. The history. It's within the start, and once again, we're seeing that early Holocene pine period from about 10,000 years ago to 8,000 years ago. It's a bit of a mystery if whether it became something like our FDC communities during the warmer parts of the mid-Holocene. And then since around 6,000 years ago, they've been pretty much what they are now. So they've been there quite some time. So there's a little bit of overlap. FDC communities are, at least fire origin ones, are exceedingly rare. And they're getting rarer because they're now being converted to potato fields and places like that. But if you can have, we got a lot of FDN communities. So if you want to use some fire or some silvicultural practices that emulate fire, you can do a lot for the flora, or for the FDC flora. Rotations in the fire regime. Rotation of stand replacing fires about equal again to the longevity of the trees. Rotation of maintenance fires is less than, but not hugely less than, the longevity of initial cohort trees. Severe fires, once again, it's coniferous forest. Severity was estimated to be high and generally extensive across these flat sand plains. Normal dynamics. Succession, once again, sort of follows that longevity model of succession. Here, quaking aspen, jack pine, and paper birch could have all been in the initial cohort, but apparently jack pines outlive quaking aspen and paper birch outlive jack pines on these kinds of sites. Young forests were basically quaking aspen, jack pine, and paper birch. They were very densely stocked. We're down now, the inter-tree distances are down under 40 and maybe as low as 30 in these young forests. And you can see the distances now, they're pretty tight and start to go up. Now we can invoke the idea that crown interactions have something to do with trees spacing themselves out a little bit over time. The transitioning involved the successive decline of the initial cohort trees and release of red pine and ultimately the ingress of white pine as they escaped fire for quite some time. And mature forests were dominated by red and white pine, but second cohort aspen and birch beneath due to the surface fires. Okay, getting close to the end. Fire dependent forests on the Canadian Shield. So we're talking about this area in far northeastern Minnesota. This is not my picture, but it's pretty typical of what you might see in the boundary waters, where we have very shallow soils over bedrock. And if you think those soils are shallow, check this one out. This was on the north side of Burnside Lake. Quite a bit of rock outcrops in that. There's just a skiff of dirt on top of these things. And up to about 40 inches is where we see the break between more mesic communities and these fire-dependent ones. How you know the soils are 40 inches deep is beyond me. You dig a hole up there and see how many rocks you hit and assume that your little itty-bitty hole is representative of how much stuff is on top of the actual bedrock. But it's a mess and it's hard to do. Apparently we had enough road cuts to help the soil scientists out a little bit. But this is what we're seeing now. Lots of development of ladder fuel in the understory. There's just tons of fir and white spruce. Even in some places, there's a fair amount of these drains that are running on bedrock, but you hear them in spring. You can hear water running at some depth up there someplace. And quite often those little drains are full of either black ash or northern white cedar. In this case, it's northern white cedar. And it's not unusual in these communities to see some upland northern white cedar. Apparently some of these got protected enough that cedar can invade after a fire. It grows in your yard after all, out in the open. What's the big deal? But boy, it takes it on the chin if it does get burnt. I think this is the Ham Lake fire. I know this is the Little Sioux fire. I took this picture in the late 1970s. You can see what it does. It just burns away, but mostly organics and any kind of soil. And that is all jack pine regeneration where there's anything left of the soil. So it occurs almost exclusively in the new northern LMF province. Ooh. And new domain maybe to a little bit, to a certain extent. Extends well though into northwestern Ontario. The FDN forests occur where the overall soil depth is less than about 40 inches over bedrock. I prefer to let the vegetation tell me if there's about 40 inches as opposed to the other way around. The three community classes are along a moisture gradient. And these FDN communities can be pine dominated, including jack pine, red pine, and white pine. And now if we have associated trees with our pine trees, they tend to have more boreal distributions. So that's the difference between sand and bedrock. We're seeing the boreal species, as you might guess, on the Canadian Shield, and we're seeing the Great Lakes species on the places where we have sandy examples of these. The history, there isn't any, not much. After that spruce woodland period, these places have been pretty much what they are. They have been forest forever. So I did something a little bit different. And I looked at pond diagrams going way up. Those are Fonte Bork's pond diagrams going way up into Canada. I thought instead of, well, there's no change to talk about, none of this species overlap stuff to discuss. What happens when, if you look at over all the communities that we've covered, which is the fire dependent on Canadian Shield, fire dependent northern on sand, northwestern fire dependent, southern fire dependent forest, and central fire dependent forest. That's the number of those major vegetation changes that they have experienced in the past. There's a general but not remarkable pattern between the number of species you find in a plot. So a standard plot. So the species richness goes up the more of these major vegetation changes we've seen. Like I said, not overwhelmingly, but maybe 15, 20% more species, something like that. You can do the same thing when you look at fire rotation. Shorter the rotation, the more species we find. So, and you know, what I could have done in that bottom one, instead of the rotation that guesses, I could have put tree spacing in there too. You would have seen the same thing. The sparser the forest, the more species we tend to find because there's more openings and stuff. So that tells us as practitioners, if you got a densely stocked young pine plantation, getting a little bit of light on there sooner and getting thin, you know, getting in there and thinning it, allowing for some openings on the ground will give you, in general, a richer flora. The rotation guesses. Stand replacing fires equal to or longer than the longevity of the trees. And the rotation of maintenance fires are equal to or greater than. Look at that. All of a sudden, rotation of maintenance fires seems to be longer. That could just be all explained when you're calculating rotations as mostly crown fires in the day, drops down when the humidity goes up at night, creeps along, probably doesn't cover as much area as a crown fire. That might just be, that's an easy explanation for those kinds of results. So the intensity was obviously severe, severity's high, totally fries white spruce and fir. Now we have chronic budworm outbreaks because these fire-dependent communities are getting totally enriched in their understories in the amount of fir and basically budworm food that's available to them. Often extensive, but it's a fairly rugged landscape. So there's some fire breaks, lots of lakes and stuff like that. Normal course of succession follows the longevity model. Apparently jack pines outlive aspen and black spruce outlive jack pine. Young forests are dominated by aspen, jack pine, and black spruce. Densely stocked, now inter-tree distances are down to about 20 to 25 links. That's pretty tight spacing. See that there's little variation? That's tight. And I would, if I had to explain why trees are pretty evenly spaced, probably has to do with canopy and crown interactions between trees that tightly spaced to each other. Transitioning involves the successive decline of initial cohort jack pine and aspen. You do see some tolerant species coming in later on. The mature forests were dominated by red and white pine, with second cohort paper birch, white spruce, and northern white cedar beneath when they had the chance to escape fire. So, to conclude, basically this is what Minnesota looks like if you put what you think the rotation of any fire is as a characteristic of a landform in this state. Short rotation, low severity fires in the southwest, longer rotations and more severe fires in the northeast. Nearly all of our landforms, though, do have some fire-dependent vegetation on them. So even if you work in Grand Marais, there's still something to do. At the height of mid-Holocene warming, all of Minnesota was dominated by fire-dependent plant communities. That has had, to some extent, an indelible effect on the flora. Okay. All of our aspen parklands, oak woodlands, central pine woodlands were all formerly prairies at one point in time. Only our northern fire-dependent forests have been forest since deglaciation. So they're wildly different, even though the cover types can be identical. What you see underneath them isn't the same. Using fire to manage more common fire-dependent woodlands has the potential to lifeboat species of rare communities. That was what I told you was what I wanted to get across today. Chronic surface fires maintain aspen parkland and oak woodlands to the point to where they never did exhibit tolerance-based succession and never achieved full stocking. We have some regeneration standards that are just wildly optimistic, I'll put it that way, in some of these places, and maybe we should recognize what a woodland is and why it's different from a forest. And our central and northern pine forests have longer rotations to the point to where they ultimately do exhibit some tolerance-based succession from the far northeast, and right now we're seeing an awful lot of these places getting loaded up with red maple, and we're seeing red oak is starting to appear in quite a bit of land of our inventory. So some species are reacting to that change. And for foresters who think pine trees can't do it on their own.
All right.
By the way, that's a native grassland underneath that white pine, so it's doing just fine.
Well, John, thank you. That was a great talk. We've got a bunch of questions, 13 questions.
Oh, no.
I wish we could get to all of them, and we're not going to.
Okay.
But I do want to make sure we get to a couple. So with 10 votes here, did you consider the impact of indigenous burning on floristic community and NPC analysis? And if so, how?
I considered it, but scale was a bit of an issue. I mean, people, if you're around the lake, the answer is yeah. And what we tend to see, though, is that if you are in the northern floristic region and you are seeing a central fire-dependent community, I guarantee you that that's the result of cultural burning. So, wild rice lakes, you will see all kinds of central vegetation. So that's what I mostly saw. I did think about it, and we certainly know people are very actively doing those things, but it was a matter of scale, and particularly when we were into this hierarchical mapping stuff. Those are pretty big map units. But there were certainly hot spots within them, and there were certainly prairies that were maintained by the Indians within especially our central fire-dependent systems, the Shell Prairie, Fishhook Prairie, Hubbard Prairie, all of the great potato land.
Great. We'll do one or two more questions. We're going to have to shorten our break by about half. But next question with 9 votes. Any sense of how important large ungulates were, like elk and bison, for maintaining the historical Aspen Parklands mosaic?
I already said that. No. I think if we had anything that looked like a savanna, I think that was the case. And in fact, some of the archaeologists I've worked with were suggested that cultural burning, a lot of it had to do with the Chippewas trying to keep bison in the forest, where they didn't have to compete or fight with Sioux Indians over bison. So a lot of that culture burning, particularly up and down the river corridors, apparently was aimed at overwintering bison and elk. So there's no doubt that I think absolutely if they certainly had a physiognomic effect floristically, who would know? I mean, I haven't seen a bison around here for a while. I was just starting at the DNR when they were around.
So there are a number of other questions. We'll just do one more, and I don't know how quick or easy it is to answer, but it's the same question that I threw at Greg, and he deferred to you.
Oh.
What can you say about relationships or how the Minnesota
Certainly.
DNR NPCs fit into the land type association framework that Greg talked about? Are they land types, land type phases, something else? Maybe that's referring to the units that he discussed. Can you say anything?
Yeah, of course. This is the National Hierarchical Classification is a multi-factor classification. They consider soils, climate, different things at different scales. At these fine scales you're talking about, it's mostly soils. So we sampled soils and we sampled vegetation. Our NPC classes are very close to the ELTP concept. It's the vegetational component of a multi-factor classification. So most of the ELTPs and even some of the ELTs, and both the CHIP, and we're working with Superior quite a bit now, you can probably describe the vegetation using our native plant community classification. So that's the scale at which it enters, but it is only one of several considerations in multi-factor mapping. That is what Greg is doing.
All right. So we're going to leave it there. Sorry we didn't get to anywhere near all the questions. Thank you, folks, for submitting them and voting them around. It's really interesting to see what's there. We're going to go right to break. We are going to have to resume. Oh, yeah.